What if the chaos unfolding in our world today, political upheaval, economic instability, the crumbling of systems we once trusted, was predicted centuries ago? Not by modern analysts or futuristic algorithms, but by an ancient civilization gazing into the flames of prophecy. The Aztecs, a people whose empire once dominated Mesoamerica, left behind cryptic warnings etched in stone and woven into myth. Their seers spoke of cycles of destruction and rebirth, of empires rising only to collapse under the weight of their own excess. And as we look around at the fractures in our own society, it's hard not to wonder, were they seeing glimpses of our time? Long before the first European ships appeared on the horizon, the Aztecs built a civilization so vast and sophisticated it rivaled the greatest kingdoms of the ancient world. Yet they also lived with a haunting awareness that nothing lasts forever. Their myths told of 5 suns, 5 eras of human existence, each ending in catastrophic collapse. The 4th sun, they believed, was destroyed by floods, just as our modern world grapples with rising seas and climate disasters. The 5th sun, the era we're living in now, was prophesied to end in earthquakes and upheaval. But here's what's truly chilling. The Aztecs didn't just predict doom. They left behind clues about the patterns that lead to collapse, patterns that mirror our own societal fractures with unsettling precision. So how could a civilization that vanished over 500 years ago have seen so clearly into the future? Were their prophecies divine visions, or were they observing something universal about the rise and fall of empires? From the overextension of power to the disconnect between rulers and the people, the Aztecs documented warnings that feel ripped from today's headlines. This isn't just about ancient history, it's about the eerie parallels between their world and ours. And as we unravel their predictions, we might just find the keys to understanding our own fragile moment in time. The story begins with a question: are we living through the unraveling they foresaw? To understand why the Aztecs saw collapse as inevitable, we need to step into their worldview, one where time moved in great spirals, not straight lines. They believed the universe had already lived through 4 previous eras, each called a sun, each ending in disaster. The first sun was devoured by jaguars, the second destroyed by hurricanes, the third consumed by fire, and the fourth drowned in floods. These weren't just myths, they were cautionary tales, prophecies encoded in their temples and rituals. The Aztecs saw themselves as living under the 5th sun, destined to be shattered by earthquakes. But here's what's fascinating: they didn't just passively accept this fate. Their entire society was built around delaying the inevitable, offering sacrifices to keep the sun moving, to stave off chaos for one more day. This cyclical thinking shaped everything: how they ruled, how they waged war, even how they planted crops. Kings justified conquests as buying time for their people. Priests scanned the stars for signs of decay, and farmers whispered prayers against drought. The Aztecs weren't just preparing for the end, they were obsessed with reading its early warnings. And when you look at their lists of omens, strange lights in the sky, crops failing without reason, leaders growing distant from their people, it's hard not to see reflections of our own anxieties. Climate reports sound like their flood prophecies. Political divisions mirror their warnings about rulers losing touch. Even their belief that collapse comes when the gods grow weary feels eerily similar to modern fears of societal exhaustion. What makes their perspective so gripping isn't just the accuracy, it's the pattern recognition. They noticed that empires don't fall overnight. First comes overreach, then corruption, then a slow unraveling of trust. Their 5th sun wasn't doomed because the gods willed it, but because all systems, no matter how grand, carry the seeds of their own destruction, and that's where the real prophecy lies. The Aztecs weren't predicting a specific date or event, they were mapping the anatomy of collapse itself. When their emperor Moctezuma hesitated to confront Cortés, was it just fear, or did he recognize a cycle repeating? A civilization at its peak, blind to the cracks widening beneath it. Today, we don't sacrifice hearts to the sun, we sacrifice stability to short-term gains, ecosystems to profit margins, unity to polarization. The names have changed, but the patterns feel hauntingly familiar. The Aztecs would have understood our obsession with dystopian fiction, our doom-scrolling through crisis headlines, because they knew prophecies aren't about fortune-telling. They're mirrors. If their fifth sun ends in earthquakes, maybe it's because societies, like tectonic plates, build up pressure until something has to give. The legend of the fifth sun, or Nahui Alan, isn't just another doomsday myth. It's a blueprint of collapse written in symbols so vivid they could have been ripped from today's climate reports. According to Aztec cosmology, this era was destined to end in a cataclysm of earthquakes, famine, and social chaos. But what's striking isn't the destruction itself, it's the conditions that lead to it. The Aztecs didn't see disaster as random. They saw it as the inevitable result of imbalance when societies take more than they give, when leaders ignore warning signs, when the land itself is pushed past its limits. Sound familiar? Take the prophecy's emphasis on earthquakes. For the Aztecs, tremors weren't just geological events, they were metaphors for societal rupture. Just as tectonic plates grind until pressure forces a violent release, civilizations accumulate tensions, wealth gaps widen, institutions corrode, trust erodes. The Aztecs believed these fractures would climax in a final, shattering collapse. Now consider our world. Over the past 50 years, income inequality has skyrocketed to levels unseen since the Gilded Age. Political polarization has turned debates into fault lines, and beneath it all, the literal ground shakes more frequently, with scientists linking increased seismic activity to human-induced factors like fracking and drilling. The parallels are unnerving. Then there's famine, the second horseman of the fifth sun's apocalypse. The Aztecs lived in delicate harmony with their environment, relying on intricate agricultural systems like chinampas, floating gardens that turned swamps into breadbaskets. But their prophecies warned that when crops failed, it wouldn't be by accident. It would be a symptom of deeper sickness, overexploitation, short-term thinking, the arrogance of assuming nature's patience was infinite. Fast forward to our era of monoculture farming, where 75% of global food diversity has vanished in a century, or the way climate change is shifting rainfall patterns, turning fertile regions into dust bowls. Even the language we use mirrors theirs. Modern scientists talk about tipping points and feedback loops, terms that wouldn't feel out of place in an Aztec priest's warning. But here's where the prophecy gets really chilling. The Aztecs didn't just predict environmental breakdown, they foresaw the human response to it. Their texts describe panic as food stores vanish, leaders clinging to power while offering hollow solutions, communities turning on each other. Compare that to the chaos of modern supply chain crises, or the way climate migration is already fueling border tensions worldwide. The Aztecs understood that scarcity doesn't just test infrastructure, it tests morality. And their most haunting insight: collapse is rarely a single event. It's a cascade where failing systems drag others down with them. A drought leads to crop failure, which sparks inflation, which fuels unrest, which paralyzes governments. A domino effect we're seeing play out in real time from Syria to Sudan. Yet woven into this bleak vision is a thread of hope. The fifth sun's destruction wasn't framed as punishment, it was a reset, a chance to rebuild with wisdom. The Aztecs even had a ritual for it, the new fire ceremony held every 52 years. Priests would extinguish every flame in the empire, then light a single new fire, symbolizing renewal. In their eyes, survival wasn't about avoiding collapse, but learning from it. That's the key difference between despair and prophecy. Despair says the end is inevitable. Prophecy says the future is shaped by the choices we make now. When Greta Thunberg tells world leaders, "Our house is on fire," she's speaking the same symbolic language as Aztec seers. The question is, will we heed the warning this time? Moctezuma II was a ruler haunted by visions. In the years leading up to the Spanish invasion, his scribes recorded a chilling catalogue of omens, events so bizarre they seemed ripped from a nightmare. A comet split the night sky, its twin tails burning like torches. The temple of Huitzilopochtli, god of war, burst into flames without warning, the sacred structure devoured by an inferno no water could quench. Fishermen hauled in birds with strange mirrors embedded in their heads, and villagers swore they heard statues weeping in the dark. To modern ears, these sound like superstitions. But what if they weren't just random frights? What if Moctezuma was documenting something far more profound, the subconscious tremors of an empire on the brink? Today, we have satellites tracking hurricanes and algorithms predicting economic crashes, but the underlying principle hasn't changed. Societies on the edge of collapse emit warning signals, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. The Aztec chronicles describe noblemen dreaming of armies marching under crosses years before Cortés arrived. Psychologists might call this precognitive anxiety, when a culture's collective unease manifests in symbols. Think of the eerie parallels in our own time. Before the 2008 financial crisis, Wall Street traders joked about the big one in hushed tones. Before the pandemic, epidemiologists published fictional accounts of global outbreaks. Like Moctezuma's priests scanning the stars, we sense storms before they hit. The most unsettling detail in these accounts isn't the omens themselves, it's how they were interpreted. When temple priests reported a woman shrieking about impending doom in the marketplace, Moctezuma ordered her imprisoned, not investigated. When astronomers warned of celestial disturbances, courtiers dismissed them as bad dreams. Here lies the tragic irony. The Aztecs had sophisticated systems for tracking planetary cycles, yet their leadership ignored the very signs their culture trained them to heed. Sound familiar? Modern climate scientists issue increasingly desperate reports while politicians debate short-term budgets. Tech ethicists warn of artificial intelligence risks as corporations race to deploy unchecked algorithms. The mechanisms differ, but the pattern repeats, elites dismissing alarms because acknowledging them would upend the status quo. Moctezuma's fatal mistake wasn't failing to predict disaster. It was failing to act on predictions already in hand. His library contained centuries of astronomical data, agricultural records hinting at drought cycles, even diplomatic reports describing pale strangers in distant lands. The pieces were there, yet when Cortés landed, the emperor hesitated, vacillating between welcoming the Spaniards as gods and fearing them as destroyers. That paralysis mirrors our own age of doom scrolling, consuming endless warnings about climate collapse or political instability while feeling powerless to change course. The Aztec prophecies suggest a harrowing truth. Collapse isn't just about external threats. It's about what happens when a society becomes mesmerized by its own unraveling. But buried in this grim history is a sliver of light. The Aztecs believed omens weren't just fate's verdict, they were invitations to course correct. Had Moctezuma heeded the weeping statues as calls to strengthen social bonds, or the temple fire as a warning to reform corrupt priests, might history have unfolded differently? Today's equivalent might be treating wildfires and heat waves not as inevitabilities, but as prompts to rethink energy systems, or viewing political extremism as a symptom of broken trust rather than an unstoppable tide. The Aztecs teach us that prophecies don't exist to paralyze, they exist to provoke, because in the end, the most dangerous omen isn't a comet or a burning temple. It's the refusal to see them for what they are, not endings but crossroads. Long before Spanish sails appeared on the horizon, Aztec priests whispered of a vision that would shake their world, mountains floating on water, moving with unnatural speed. To a civilization that had never seen an ocean-going ship, the prophecy seemed impossible. How could stone and earth drift like reeds on a lake? Yet when Cortez's fleet arrived in 1519, the metaphor became terrifying reality. The Aztecs called the Spanish ships towers that walk on waves, not just because of their size, but because they represented something far more dangerous: the collision of two technological realities, one about to be rendered obsolete. This moment reveals a pattern that repeats throughout history: disruptive technology arriving like a foreign invader, upending the balance of power. The Aztecs mastered agriculture, astronomy, and hydraulic engineering, but their spears were useless against gunpowder. Their messengers running across vast stone roads couldn't compete with printed letters carried by sailing ships. The prophecy wasn't about literal mountains, it was about asymmetrical change, where one society's advancements make another's strength irrelevant. Now consider our own era. Artificial intelligence isn't just another tool, it's a floating mountain. Political systems designed for slow deliberation can't keep pace with algorithms shaping public opinion in milliseconds. Traditional economies falter as digital currencies bypass centuries of financial infrastructure. Like the Aztecs staring at alien ships, we're realizing too late that our institutions weren't built for this world. The eerie precision of this prophecy lies in its focus on perception. The Aztec scribes didn't describe the ship's weapons or tactics, they fixated on their unnatural movement. Why? Because disruption isn't just about what new technology does, it's about how it shatters a society's understanding of what's possible. When deepfake videos manipulate public figures' words with flawless precision, or chatbots replicate human thought without consciousness, it creates the same existential disorientation the Aztecs felt watching wooden towers glide against the wind. Their priests scrambled to fit the ships into their cosmology, calling them divine one day and demonic the next, a whiplash we recognize in modern debates, labeling AI everything from savior to extinction risk. But here's where the Aztec warning cuts deepest. Their collapse wasn't caused by Spanish steel alone. It was accelerated by internal fractures. Elite factions exploited the crisis for power grabs. Provincial tribes saw an opportunity to overthrow imperial taxes, and longtime allies hesitated to send aid. Technological disruption doesn't destroy empires, it exposes their hidden vulnerabilities. Today, AI-generated misinformation doesn't create political polarization, it weaponizes existing divides. Automation doesn't invent economic inequality, it amplifies decades of wage stagnation. The floating mountains were never the real threat, they were the catalyst that turned cracks into chasms. Yet buried in this grim history is an unexpected insight. The Aztecs' greatest miscalculation wasn't technological, it was imaginative. They assumed the ship's arrival fit their cyclical view of history, perhaps marking the prophesied return of the god Quetzalcoatl. Their failure to grasp that this was something entirely new, a rupture rather than a repetition, left them paralyzed. Our challenge today is the opposite. We're so obsessed with novelty that we miss the ancient patterns at work. Stock markets soar on AI hype while ignoring bubbles that always burst. Governments chase quantum computing breakthroughs but repeat the same mistakes with surveillance and control. The floating temple vision reminds us disruption doesn't erase history, it forces us to reckon with it in ways we never expected. Perhaps the most haunting lesson lies in what the Aztecs didn't predict. None of their prophecies mentioned smallpox, the invisible stowaway on those ships that would kill millions. Today's equivalent might be the unintended consequences we can't yet see. Not the AI we debate in headlines, but the secondary effects lurking in its code. Maybe it's not job losses we should fear most, but how automated systems might silently reshape human behavior, or how quantum encryption could make entire governments obsolete overnight. The Aztecs teach us that true disruption isn't just about the visible floating mountains, it's about the currents beneath them, shifting in ways no prophet could fully foresee. The Aztecs spoke of rivers running red not just from battle, but from a deeper sickness in the land itself. Their codices describe waters thick with rust, fish floating belly up, farmers kneeling to drink only to gag on the metallic tang. At first glance, it sounds like plague or pollution, but their priests interpreted it differently, a symbol of wealth concentrated in the hands of the few while the many starved. When tribute payments bled provinces dry, when merchants hoarded maize during famine, the people whispered that the rivers had turned to blood not literally, but because life's sustenance had become poisoned by greed. Fast forward to today's financial reports where the metaphor takes on unsettling new forms. The top 1% now hold over 44% of global wealth, a disparity so vast economists call it the Great Divergence. Stock markets hit record highs while food banks run empty. Cryptocurrency billionaires mint fortunes in seconds as rents crush entire generations. This isn't just inequality, it's the modern equivalent of those crimson rivers where resources flow toward artificial reservoirs while the rest of the basin runs dry. The Aztecs would have recognized this pattern instantly. Their glyph for economic collapse showed a broken water jar, not because water vanished, but because the system to share it shattered. Dig deeper into their warnings and you'll find eerie specifics. The Blood Rivers prophecy coincided with accounts of speculators cornering the cotton market, of warlords demanding tribute in feathers and jade until villages had nothing left but mud bricks. Sound familiar? Modern hedge funds now trade algorithms instead of textiles, but the game remains the same, extracting value until the underlying structure fails. The 2008 crash revealed banks peddling toxic assets, a phrase that could have been lifted from an Aztec scroll. Their merchants warned of false cacao beans, hollow replicas sold to inflate prices. Today, we call them subprime mortgages or meme stocks. The labels change, the deception doesn't. What makes these parallels so jarring isn't just the repetition of greed, it's how both cultures visualized collapse. The Aztecs didn't chart wealth gaps with spreadsheets, they painted them as ecological disasters. A river turning to blood wasn't merely poetic, it signaled a breakdown in reciprocity, the sacred balance where rulers were supposed to redistribute wealth like water through irrigation channels. When that contract broke, society itself hemorrhaged. Modern economists echo this with terms like circulation collapse or liquidity crisis. When money stops flowing to where it's needed, the system seizes up like a body choking on its own blood. Yet the Aztecs offered something most contemporary analyzers miss, a visceral understanding of how economic decay feels. Their descriptions of blood rivers included details we'd now call indices of despair, mothers selling children into slavery during famines, artisans burning their own workshops when taxes devoured profits. Today's equivalent might be the opioid epidemic raging in deindustrialized towns, or deaths of despair soaring in communities gutted by outsourcing. The numbers tell one story, the human toll another. The Aztecs recorded both, understanding that financial systems aren't abstract, they're the bedrock of survival. When they fracture, people don't just go poor, they lose their place in the universe. This is where their prophecy becomes most urgent. The blood rivers weren't just an economic warning, they were a spiritual diagnosis. The Aztecs believed wealth wasn't truly owned, it was stewarded for the gods. Hoarding it corrupted the soul of the hoarder as much as the body of the starving. Contrast that with modern CEOs boasting about maximizing shareholder value while laying off thousands, or politicians slashing safety nets to fund stock buybacks. The Aztecs would have seen these not as savvy maneuvers, but as rituals of societal self-harm, akin to drinking from those poisoned rivers and calling it victory. But within this grim vision lies a key insight the modern world often misses. Collapse isn't irreversible. The Aztecs performed elaborate cleansing rituals to heal the blood rivers, symbolically restoring balance through debt forgiveness and land redistribution. Of course, their solutions were imperfect, often intertwined with conquest or human sacrifice. Yet their core realization holds power. Economic recovery requires more than technical fixes. It demands a recalibration of values. Modern examples like post-war Marshall Plan investments or Iceland's post-crisis prosecution of bankers hint at this truth. When societies treat wealth as a shared trust rather than private plunder, the rivers can run clear again. The final lesson from these ancient prophecies isn't about doom, it's about patterns. The Aztecs tracked economic collapse not as a sudden event but as a sequence. First come exploitation, then distrust, then systemic failure. Today's algorithms can predict credit defaults with uncanny accuracy, yet miss the broader human dynamics those numbers represent. Perhaps we need to supplement our data with something older, a recognition that when workers can't afford the goods they make, when housing becomes a speculative game rather than shelter, when money flows endlessly upward like blood pooling in a corpse, the warning signs aren't just statistical. They're written in water, in history, in the echoes of a civilization that saw its own reflection in the Scarlet Tide. The prophecy of Quetzalcoatl's return wasn't just a myth, it was a ticking clock embedded in Aztec consciousness. According to legend, the feathered serpent god who once brought knowledge, agriculture, and cosmic order vowed to come back in a time of great upheaval. But here's the twist: his return wasn't framed as salvation. It was a reckoning. The Aztecs believed Quetzalcoatl would arrive from the east, pale-skinned and bearded, to judge a society that had strayed from balance. When Cortés landed on the exact shores foretold, wearing armor that gleamed like reptilian scales, the psychological impact was catastrophic. Moctezuma didn't just face an invader, he confronted a divine verdict. This collision of prophecy and reality reveals something universal about how cultures process collapse. When systems fray, people don't just fear chaos, they hunger for meaning. The Aztecs reached for their god's promise like a lifeline, even as it dragged them under. Modern parallels are everywhere. During economic crashes, crowds flock to populist leaders peddling messianic slogans. Amid climate disasters, fringe movements peddle conspiracy theories about extraterrestrial saviors or secret technologies. The details differ, but the pattern holds. When the world feels out of control, we rewrite strangers as deities and coincidences as destiny. Quetzalcoatl's myth also exposes the dangerous allure of leadership vacuums during decline. The Aztec Empire wasn't toppled by Spanish guns alone. It unraveled from within because Moctezuma, paralyzed by prophecy, couldn't decide whether to fight or worship Cortés. His hesitation created a power void that rival factions rushed to fill. Provincial governors saw a chance to break free, disgruntled nobles plotted coups, and by the time the Aztecs rallied under Cuauhtémoc, the empire was already a fractured shell. History constantly echoes this script. The fall of Rome accelerated when rival emperors spent more time battling each other than barbarians. The French Revolution descended into terror as competing factions all claimed to be the true voice of the people. Even today, polarized nations watch governments stall while crises mount, each side waiting for their version of Quetzalcoatl, a leader who never comes. But the deepest lesson lies in how prophecies morph under pressure. The original Quetzalcoatl legends described a benevolent teacher who rejected human sacrifice. Yet by Moctezuma's era, priests had twisted the narrative, claiming the god demanded blood upon his return. This wasn't theology, it was desperation. Facing crop failures and rebellions, the Aztec elite weaponized prophecy to justify brutality, just as modern regimes invoke national destiny to silence dissent. The feathered serpent story reminds us, myths don't cause collapse, but collapsing societies will distort myths to fit their unraveling. Perhaps the most haunting question isn't why the Aztecs believed, it's why we still do. From doomsday cults to QAnon, the urge to conflate crisis with cosmic drama hasn't faded. Scientists may track pandemics with viral genomes instead of comet tails, but when panic hits, reason often buckles. The Aztecs teach us that prophecies are less about predicting the future than revealing the present. Their Quetzalcoatl wasn't a real god returning, he was a mirror reflecting their own crumbling certainty. And in that reflection, we might just see ourselves. At first glance, the Aztec Sun stone appears to be a magnificent work of ancient art, a 24-ton masterpiece of carved basalt, its concentric circles pulsing with intricate glyphs and celestial imagery. But look closer and you'll find something far darker lurking in its geometry. This wasn't just a calendar, it was a doomsday clock, its symbols mapping out the fragile boundaries between order and annihilation. The four jagged claws of the Oslotanatia, the jaguar sun, grip the stone's edges, representing the first epoch of creation, an era that ended with the earth ripped apart by savage beasts. Next to it, the winged serpent Quetzalcoatl bears its fangs, a reminder of the hurricane that obliterated the second sun. These weren't decorative motifs, they were warnings carved in stone for a civilization that knew collapse wasn't a matter of if, but when. What makes the sun stone so eerily resonant today is how its apocalyptic imagery mirrors our own cultural obsession with the end times. The Aztecs saw cosmic monsters waiting to devour the world. We flood movie screens with zombies, asteroids, and climate catastrophes. Their priests tracked celestial cycles for signs of doom. Our algorithms churn out predictive models of societal collapse. Even the stone's central figure, the dismembered god Tanatia, his tongue lolling like a sacrificial blade, finds its echo in modern dystopian tales where heroes are torn apart to sustain broken systems. The parallels aren't coincidental. Both cultures use myth to process the same terrifying truth. Civilizations are mortal. Dig into the stone's lesser-known glyphs, and the connections grow even more unsettling. The fire serpent Quetzalcoatl, coiled around the stone's outer ring, doesn't just symbolize destruction, it embodies the cyclical nature of crisis. To the Aztecs, fire wasn't purely destructive, it was transformative, burning away the old to make space for the new. Today's prepper communities hoarding generators and canned goods, or tech billionaires building bunkers in New Zealand, are enacting the same primal ritual, preparing for the purge they believe will rebirth the world. The stone's message is clear: collapse isn't an aberration, it's part of the ecosystem. Yet the sun stone's most provocative detail might be what's missing. Unlike Western doomsday prophecies, which often climax with divine judgment or redemption, the Aztec vision offers no savior. There's no rapture, no messiah, just an endless wheel of creation and destruction turning on the axis of human choices. Modern conspiracy theories thrive on the opposite premise: hidden cabals pulling strings, alien overlords waiting to intervene. The stone rejects these fantasies. Its monsters aren't lurking in shadows, they're the natural consequences of imbalance, as inevitable as a forest fire after a drought. When our climate reports warn of tipping points or economists chart debt spirals, we're speaking the sunstone's language. This is why the artifact still captivates us. It doesn't just predict collapse, it visualizes the psychological toll of living under its shadow. The faces carved into its surface, gods frozen in expressions of agony or ecstasy, mirror our own whiplash between despair and denial. One day we're stockpiling supplies, the next we're scrolling past wildfire headlines to watch cat videos. The Aztecs ritualized this tension in the new fire ceremony, where they extinguished every flame in the empire, then lit a single torch to symbolize hope amidst darkness. Our version might be the way we toggle between climate protests and binge-watching post-apocalyptic dramas, simultaneously mourning the world and rehearsing its end. But the stone's ultimate lesson lies in its craftsmanship. It took generations of artisans to carve, their chisels slowly revealing the monsters hidden in the rock. In that sense, it's the perfect metaphor for collapse itself, a pattern that only becomes visible when we step back and study the larger design. Our modern prophets, from data scientists to whistleblowers, are the new stone carvers, tracing the contours of coming storms in spreadsheets and satellite images. The question isn't whether their warnings will be heeded, but whether we'll recognize the monsters we've already unleashed. After all, the Aztecs didn't need asteroids or plagues to destroy their world. They had something far more dangerous, a calendar that told them exactly how little time they had left. Tlacaelol wasn't just a political advisor, he was the architect of an empire's mythology. As chief counselor to 3 Aztec rulers in the 15th century, this shadowy figure reshaped history itself, rewriting sacred texts and manipulating prophecies to justify relentless conquest. Where priests saw omens of balance, Tlacaelol saw tools of control. He declared that the gods demanded endless war not just for survival, but to stave off collapse through perpetual motion, a philosophy that eerily prefigures modern states justifying surveillance or militarization with claims of existential threat. The genius and danger of Tlacaelol's vision lay in its circular logic. He convinced the Aztec elite that their empire existed in a fragile twilight, always one sacrifice away from annihilation. By framing expansion as divine mandate rather than ambition, he turned aggression into piety. Spanish chroniclers later recorded his infamous decree, "The sun hungers for hearts. If we stop feeding it, the world dies." This wasn't theology, it was psychological warfare. Today's equivalents might be politicians invoking national security to bypass constitutional limits or corporations branding austerity as necessary innovation. The mechanisms differ, but the playbook remains the same. Manufacture urgency, then offer yourself as the sole solution. Tlacaelol's most lasting manipulation was his reinvention of the god Huitzilopochtli. Once a minor deity associated with the South, he transformed the hummingbird god into a bloodthirsty sun warrior whose appetite justified endless campaigns. Temples rose where dissenters had stood, tax rolls swelled under the banner of sacred tribute. The parallels to modern propaganda machines are unavoidable. When colonial powers recast plunder as civilizing missions, or when media empires spin exploitation as disruption, they're speaking Tlacaelol's language. His true prophecy wasn't about the gods, it was about how easily fear can be institutionalized. Yet the vizier's greatest trick was making collapse a self-fulfilling prophecy. By insisting the empire needed constant war to survive, he ensured its eventual downfall. The Aztecs stretched their supply lines thin, conquering distant cities like Xoconochco for jade and cacao, all while resentment festered among vassal states. When Cortés arrived, these subjugated peoples didn't rally to defend Tenochtitlan, they joined the invaders. Tlacaelol's fear-based governance had hollowed out the empire's foundation long before Spanish cannons finished the job. Modern superpowers repeating this pattern might recognize the warning. No society can sustain itself forever on manufactured crises. What makes Tlacaelol's story so uncomfortably relevant isn't just his tactics, it's his legacy. After his death, scribes secretly recorded dissent, noting how villagers whispered that the gods never asked for so much blood. But the machine he built kept running on inertia, its priests too invested in the myth to question it. Historians now see this as the hallmark of late-stage collapse, when a system's guardians would rather double down than admit error. From climate denialism to algorithmic authoritarianism, we're surrounded by modern Tlacaelol's figures who'd sooner rewrite reality than face its warnings. The chilling twist, Tlacaelol himself may have known the truth. Fragments of his personal writings suggest he saw the empire's flaws but believed chaos could only be held at bay through control. In that sense, he becomes something far more complex than a villain, a tragic figure trapped by his own prophecies. Today's leaders justifying draconian measures to preserve democracy or save the economy might recognize the same gnawing doubt. Perhaps the real lesson of Tlacaelol isn't about how prophecies are forged, but how they become prisons for those who believe them and those forced to live by them. The massacre at Colula wasn't just a military tactic, it was a collision of prophecy and panic, a moment when Cortés unwittingly stepped into an ancient narrative of doom. The Aztecs had long foretold that their downfall would begin with a bloodbath at sacred ground, a sign that the gods had abandoned them. So when the Spanish slaughtered thousands in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, the very heart of Mesoamerican spirituality, it didn't just shock the empire. It confirmed their deepest fears. The streets ran red not just with blood, but with the terrible certainty that the Fifth Sun's end had arrived. What's chilling about Colula is how ritualized the violence became. The Spanish claimed they uncovered an Aztec plot to ambush them, but the scale of the killing suggests something darker. Cortez's men didn't just attack soldiers, they desecrated temples, toppled idols, and left corpses stacked like offerings on the pyramid steps. To the Aztecs watching in horror, this wasn't mere brutality. It was a grotesque reenactment of their own prophecies, where foreign invaders would defile holy sites as prelude to collapse. The psychological impact was catastrophic. If the gods allowed their holiest city to be violated, what protection remained? Modern historians often frame Colula as a strategic blunder, Cortés alienating potential allies. But through the lens of prophecy, it becomes something far more profound. Empires facing existential threats don't just fight invaders, they confront the stories they've told themselves about their own fragility. The Aztecs had spent centuries preparing for the Fifth Sun's cataclysm through rituals and wars. Now here it was, unfolding not as divine judgment, but as indiscriminate slaughter by men who didn't even understand the narrative they were fulfilling. This pattern, where perceived doom accelerates actual collapse, isn't confined to ancient history. Consider how the fall of the Soviet Union was preceded by decades of Kremlin leaders fixated on imperial overstretch warnings. Or how financial analysts speak of self-fulfilling prophecies when market panics trigger the very crashes they fear. The Aztecs teach us that when a civilization becomes obsessed with its own demise, it starts seeing omens everywhere, and sometimes in the frantic effort to avert them brings them to life. The aftermath of Colula reveals the final, tragic twist. As news of the massacre spread, Aztec vassal states didn't unite against the Spanish. Many saw it as validation proof that Moctezuma's rule had lost divine favor. This is the ultimate irony of collapse prophecies. They don't just predict disintegration, they weaponize disillusionment. Today's equivalent might be how modern democracies fracture not just from external threats, but from citizens convinced the system is already beyond saving. When trust erodes, even victories feel like preludes to defeat. Yet within this horror lies an uncomfortable question. Did the Aztecs' prophecies shape their fate or merely foresee it? The distinction matters. Their seers didn't cause the Spanish invasion, but their warnings about societal rot, corrupt priests hoarding wealth, rulers deaf to dissent, created fertile ground for collapse. Similarly, our own era's dystopian anxieties aren't just fantasies. They're reflections of real fissures in our systems magnified by the lens of fear. Colula's true lesson isn't about fate. It's about how easily prophecy becomes permission to surrender, to escalate, or to mistake the end of one world for the end of all worlds. The Aztecs didn't need satellites or seismographs to sense impending disaster. They read the world itself like a living codex. Their priests tracked the erratic flights of hummingbirds, believing their sudden silence signaled political upheaval. Fishermen reported schools of fish vanishing overnight, their absence interpreted as economic collapse moving beneath the waves. Even the behavior of everyday creatures carried weight. Ants abandoning their mounds foretold famine, while owls gathering in daylight whispered of civil war. These weren't superstitions, they were a sophisticated system of ecological surveillance, where nature's rhythms became the empire's early warning system. Modern science confirms their instincts weren't entirely wrong. Today's researchers document how stressed ecosystems emit distress signals long before human systems register the damage. Coral reefs bleach months before coastal economies crash. Bees vanish from fields years before crop shortages hit supermarket shelves. The Aztecs simply lacked the vocabulary we now use terms like indicator species or environmental stressors, but their understanding of interconnected collapse was remarkably prescient. When their codices describe locust swarms darkening the sky before drought, they're not just painting poetic imagery, they're recording chain reactions we now measure with climate models. Celestial omens held even greater power. The appearance of Quetzalcoatl, the fire serpent comet, in 1491 sent shockwaves through Tenochtitlan. Priests interpreted its jagged tail as a divine blade slicing through the social order, a warning that would later seem grimly prophetic when Cortés arrived exactly 30 years later, his steel blades mirroring the comet's form. Today's astronomers might dismiss such symbolism as coincidence, but psychologists recognize the pattern. Societies under strain often project their anxieties onto celestial events. When Hale-Bopp streaked across American skies in 1997, it coincided with the Heaven's Gate suicides. When blood moons ignited end times theories in 2015, they mirrored global anxieties over financial crises and political unrest. The stars don't cause collapse, but they become its Rorschach test. What's startling is how closely Aztec observations align with modern collapse science. Researchers at the University of Maryland now track pre-collapse biomarkers in failing states, from sudden drops in nighttime lighting indicating economic paralysis to spikes in black market currency exchanges signaling loss of institutional trust. These datasets function exactly like the Aztecs' animal omens, just quantified. When their scribes noted that eagles no longer nested near temples, they were detecting what we'd call environmental degradation-induced habitat loss. When they recorded strangers appearing with mirrors that steal souls, likely smallpox scabs mistaken as reflective surfaces, they documented pandemic vectors centuries before germ theory. The critical difference lies in interpretation. Where the Aztecs saw divine wrath, we identify systemic feedback loops. Their priests blamed crop failures on angry gods. Agronomists trace them to soil depletion cycles. But both perspectives converge on the same truth. Collapse announces itself through 1,000 whispers before it ever shouts. Modern analysts monitoring Twitter for sentiment shifts ahead of stock market crashes are practicing a digital form of augury, just as Aztec priests divined futures in the entrails of sacrificed quail. Perhaps the most haunting parallel lies in what both systems miss. The Aztecs meticulously recorded comets and earthquakes but overlooked the subtler threat festering in Spanish ships, microbes, and muskets. Today, we track climate patterns and GDP curves while underestimating cascading risks like algorithmic misinformation or supply chain domino effects. Both societies became proficient at reading the omens they expected, while the true dangers slipped through the gaps in their perception. This is where ancient prophecy and modern science reach their grim accord. Collapse rarely comes from the direction you're watching. The Aztecs guarded against solar eclipses while smallpox crept ashore. We brace for cyber attacks as aquifer depletion drains civilizations underground. The lesson isn't that omens are useless, it's that the most vital warnings often wear disguises, appearing as minor anomalies until their full weight crashes down. The Florentine Codex, a sprawling 16th-century manuscript compiled by Spanish friars working with Nahua scholars, preserves voices the Aztec Empire tried to silence, its own survivors. Within its 12 volumes, a passage titled "The Broken Spears" stands out not just as history, but as a raw psychological autopsy of collapse in progress. Indigenous scribes described nobles dismissing early Spanish incursions as troublesome traders, then rationalizing massacres as misunderstandings, and finally, in the siege of Tenochtitlan, insisting the invaders would still honor sacred codes of war even as their cannons reduced temples to rubble. This wasn't just denial, it was the unraveling of a society's ability to process its own disintegration. What makes these accounts so unsettling is how precisely they mirror modern pre-collapse behaviors. The scribes recount merchants assuring customers that exotic diseases wiping out entire families were merely strong fevers, while priests declared Spanish guns harmless thunder despite seeing their effects firsthand. Today's equivalents might be politicians downplaying rising sea levels as normal fluctuations, or CEOs framing mass layoffs as workforce optimization. The human mind, it seems, defaults to familiar frameworks even when reality has shifted irrevocably beneath them. The Florentine scribes captured this dissonance in hauntingly contemporary terms. It was like watching a man insist the river wasn't rising as water filled his mouth. Deeper in the codex comes an even more revealing pattern: the selective reinterpretation of prophecy. When omens like comets and two-headed births initially appeared, they were debated openly. But as crisis escalated, the ruling class began censoring unfavorable interpretations, insisting only court-approved priests could decode divine messages. Suddenly, prophecies of renewal were amplified while warnings of doom were labeled traitorous speech. Compare this to modern media ecosystems where inconvenient scientific reports get dismissed as alarmism, or social media algorithms bury warnings about financial bubbles while amplifying bullish pundits. The Aztecs' information crisis wasn't technological, it was psychological, a communal fight against cognitive dissonance that their society ultimately lost. Yet the most devastating passages document not denial, but the moment it shattered. A nobleman named Quetzalcoatl, who survived the siege, describes women weeping not for the dead, but for the living, for the realization that everything they'd believed about their world's stability was fiction. "We became strangers to ourselves," he wrote, a line that echoes through modern accounts of refugee crises or industrial towns after factory closures. This phase of collapse is rarely about material scarcity alone, it's about the death of collective meaning. When firefighters in climate-ravaged towns whisper that their seasons no longer follow known patterns, or when economists admit their models can't explain sudden market crashes, they're experiencing what the scribes called the breaking of the inner calendar, the moment a society's mental map no longer aligns with its territory. What transforms these accounts from ancient history to urgent parable is their insight into denial's lifespan. The Aztecs didn't ignore reality indefinitely, they deferred reckoning until the cost became catastrophic. Their elites, like modern policymakers facing exponential threats, treated collapse as a problem to manage rather than a trajectory to alter. The Codex records one advisor's chillingly pragmatic suggestion: let the people eat wild grasses until the gods relent. 1,000 years later, boardrooms discuss managed decline of neighborhoods or ecosystems with the same detached calculus. Both represent the terminal phase of dissonance when avoiding panic becomes more dangerous than panic itself. The Florentine survivors leave us not with answers, but with something more valuable: a diagnostic tool. Their descriptions of officials clinging to rituals as famine spread, of generals blaming battlefield losses on improper sacrifices rather than steel armor, form a checklist of collapse cognition we can apply to our own era. When a society spends more energy justifying its myths than adapting to change, when its leaders punish truth-tellers faster than threats, when its people oscillate between paralysis and performative fury, these are the flickering lights the Aztecs mistook for control. Their broken spears still point toward our own blind spots if we dare to look. Teotihuacan's ruins loomed in the Aztec imagination like a recurring nightmare, a metropolis so grand its builders were thought to be gods, yet abandoned centuries before the Aztecs ever laid eyes on it. Walking through its silent avenues past the Pyramid of the Sun where no priests chanted, they called it the place where men became gods, but also the city of the drowned. The mystery of its collapse haunted them, shaping prophecies that warned even the greatest civilizations could vanish overnight, leaving only whispers in the wind. When Aztec scribes chronicled Teotihuacan's fall, they didn't describe invading armies or natural disasters. Instead, they pinned its demise on something subtler, a slow unraveling of purpose. The legends spoke of quarreling factions, of rulers who grew deaf to the people, of temples maintained out of habit rather than devotion. Sound familiar? Modern archaeologists confirm eerie parallels, evidence of neglected infrastructure, wealth inequality etched into housing disparities, and ritual spaces repurposed for storage as belief systems frayed. The Aztecs saw Teotihuacan not as a cautionary tale about external threats, but about internal decay, a mirror held up to their own empire's vulnerabilities. This ancient anxiety echoes in today's urban landscapes, from Detroit's abandoned factories to Dubai's unrealized skyscraper dreams. Modern ghost cities trigger the same unease. Psychologists call it ruin value, the subconscious fear that our greatest achievements could become future relics. When the Aztecs predicted the fifth sun's collapse would leave emptiness where laughter once rang, they weren't just forecasting earthquakes. They were describing the hollowness of systems that outlived their meaning: shopping malls reclaimed by weeds, subway tunnels flooded by rising seas, Silicon Valleys silenced by energy crashes. Yet the most chilling connection lies in how both societies processed decline. Teotihuacan's final years show signs of what anthropologists term crisis architecture, last-ditch monuments built taller and brighter as foundations crumbled. The Aztecs repeated this pattern, doubling down on sacrificial rituals as Spanish ships approached. Today's equivalents might be billionaire bunkers or nations investing in space colonies while Earth's ecosystems falter. The prophecy here isn't about the act of building, but what it conceals: a refusal to adapt. The Aztecs added one crucial insight modern analysts often miss. In their codices, Teotihuacan's collapse wasn't framed as tragedy, it was necessary. Just as forests need fire to regenerate, they believed civilizations required periodic dissolution to prevent stagnation. Their new fire ceremony reenacted this cycle intentionally, extinguishing all flames to relight them from a single spark. There's radical wisdom in this view. Contemporary movements advocating degrowth or managed retreat from flood zones channel a similar philosophy. Sometimes survival means letting go. Perhaps that's why Teotihuacan's ruins still captivate us. They force a question we'd rather avoid, not whether our cities will fall, but what we'll cling to when they do. The Aztecs watched migrants scavenge stones from the ancient city to build humble homes, turning collapse into continuity. Their prophets would recognize today's Detroit residents repurposing abandoned factories as urban farms, or Bangkok architects designing floating neighborhoods for a waterlogged future. The lesson isn't about preventing endings, it's about learning to begin again. Tenochtitlan didn't just rise from the lake, it was engineered to defy prophecy. At the heart of the Aztec capital stood the Templo Mayor, its twin sanctuaries honoring both Tlaloc, god of rain, and Huitzilopochtli, god of war. This wasn't just architectural grandeur, it was a calculated act of cosmological balance. The Aztecs believed their fifth sun would end in cataclysm. If the gods' competing demands weren't perfectly appeased, too much rain would bring floods, too much war would bring chaos. By physically tethering these opposing forces in stone, they built a machine for staving off apocalypse, its stairways measuring the precarious space between deluge and desolation. Beneath the temples lay an even more astonishing feat, a labyrinth of hydraulic infrastructure rivaling modern flood control systems. The Great Dike of Quetzalcoatl stretched 9 miles across Lake Texcoco, its twin walls filled with rubble to regulate water levels with precision. During droughts, sluice gates directed precious runoff to Chinampa farms. When storms came, the system absorbed surges that would have drowned lesser cities. Contemporary engineers marvel at its sophistication, a 15th-century answer to today's Thames Barrier or Netherlands Delta works. But where modern projects cite climate change as their rationale, the Aztecs were battling something just as formidable, the prophecy that their world would end in water. The parallels run deeper than engineering. Just as Rotterdam builds floating neighborhoods anticipating rising seas, Tenochtitlan's architects designed for instability. Causeways doubled as aqueducts, their removable sections functioning like ancient floodgates. Canals weren't just transport routes, they were seismic buffers, redistributing earthquake energy through liquid networks. Even the city's signature chinampas, artificial islands made from woven reeds and lake mud, served a dual purpose. Beyond growing food, their buoyant foundations acted as shock absorbers during tremors, literal floating ground for a civilization bracing against the Earth's convulsions. What makes these innovations haunting isn't their ingenuity, but their fragility in the face of unforeseen threats. The dikes could regulate seasonal floods, but not smallpox. The temples balanced cosmic forces, but not cultural imperialism. When Cortés demolished the Templo Mayor, he didn't just topple stones, he shattered the equilibrium holding the Aztec universe together. Modern megaprojects carry the same blind spots. Dubai's artificial islands withstand storms but ignore aquifer depletion. Miami's seawalls rise as opioid epidemics hollow out communities. The Aztecs teach us that infrastructure can delay collapse, but only if it addresses the right prophecies. Yet within this lesson lies a revelation. Tenochtitlan's ruins now lie beneath Mexico City's sprawl, but its hydraulic wisdom persists. Engineers battling the metropolis's sinking foundations have revived ancient techniques, using permeable ceramics inspired by chinampa design to recharge aquifers. The prophecy of cyclical collapse becomes something unexpected, a blueprint for adaptation. Perhaps true resilience isn't about building higher walls against predicted disasters, but learning to read the warnings written in the cracks of our own creations. After all, the Aztecs didn't just see their fate in temple carvings, they saw it in the way water moved or stopped moving through the world they'd built. The Quetzalcoatl festival should have been a celebration of renewal, a 20-day ceremony honoring Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, with music, dance, and the crowning of a flawless youth as the god's living embodiment. Instead, it became the spark that immolated an empire. As Spanish forces tightened their grip on Tenochtitlan in 1520, Moctezuma faced an impossible choice: cancel the sacred rites and risk divine wrath, or proceed and leave the city vulnerable. His decision to prioritize ritual over strategy reveals a chilling pattern, one we're still trapped in today. When institutions cling to routine while the world burns around them, they're not preserving tradition, they're performing the death rites of their own relevance. Look closer at the festival's fatal symmetry. The chosen youth, groomed for a year in luxury, was meant to shatter clay flutes on the temple steps before his sacrifice, symbolizing the fragility of mortal life. Yet as warriors sharpened obsidian blades for the ceremony, Cortés's lieutenant Alvarado massacred unarmed nobles in the sacred precinct, turning metaphor into horrifying reality. The Aztecs weren't blind to the threat. Palace records show generals begging to fortify the city, but the priesthood insisted the rituals were what truly kept danger at bay. Modern parallels scream for attention: central banks raising interest rates robotically as economies crumble, or politicians reciting outdated playbooks while democracies hollow out. The lesson isn't about piety versus pragmatism. It's about the moment when ceremony becomes camouflage for paralysis. What makes Quetzalcoatl so unnerving is how ordinary the collapse triggers were. The festival followed an immutable calendar: agricultural, astronomical, and political cycles all converging. To cancel it would have required admitting their entire cosmic order was obsolete. Today's equivalent might be quarterly earnings reports dictating corporate strategy despite climate tipping points, or universities churning out graduates for jobs automated into obsolescence. The Aztec priests weren't fools, they were victims of what anthropologists call ritual lock-in, where the very systems designed to ensure survival become obstacles to adaptation. When the Spanish struck, nobles were literally mid-dance, their feathered headdresses fluttering as steel blades found their throats. Yet the true tragedy lies in the alternatives the Aztecs ignored. Their own history held examples of flexible thinking, like Quetzalcoatl reforming their pantheon to unify the empire centuries earlier. Neighboring city-states had already adapted wartime protocols, shortening festivals when threats loomed. Even nature offered models. The axolotl in nearby lakes could regenerate lost limbs, yet Tenochtitlan's leaders couldn't conceive of societal regeneration. This blindness persists in modern crises. Think of pandemic planners rehearsing for flu strains while novel viruses circled, or tech giants optimizing for yesterday's algorithms as AI redrew the rules. The festival's aftermath reveals collapse's cruel irony. Survivors reported the sacred flutes kept playing even as blood slicked the temple stairs, musicians reflexively completing their rites amid slaughter. 5 centuries later, we've perfected this dissonance. Climate accords are signed as emissions hit record highs. Schools teach cursive writing while chatbots compose novels. The Quetzalcoatl paradox isn't that rituals continue during crisis, it's that we mistake motion for meaning, busyness for purpose. The Aztecs didn't fall because they honored their gods. They fell because by the time they realized the gods had changed, the streets were already running red. Cihuacotl wasn't just a goddess, she was the voice in the dark that rulers feared most. Known as the woman serpent, this deity prowled the streets of Tenochtitlan in Aztec lore, her wails piercing the night with prophecies of doom. Mothers told children her cries meant a king would fall, a city would burn. But what's striking isn't just her foresight, it's how her warnings were gendered. While male gods demanded sacrifice and war, Cihuacotl's prophecies centered on the unraveling of social fabric. Starving children, betrayed alliances, the quiet despair of those left behind when empires crumble. Her voice carried the weight of what modern sociologists might call care labor, the invisible work of holding societies together, and the first to sound alarms when they fray. Fast forward to today's protest movements, and you'll find eerie echoes of her role. When Chilean women chant El Violador Ers Tu in unison, or when Kenyan grandmothers lead climate marches through Nairobi's slums, they're channeling the same tradition, female voices amplifying the fractures others ignore. Historians note a pattern. From the bread riots of the French Revolution to the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, women have consistently been the ones to ritualize collapse before it arrives. Not because they're inherently prophetic, but because gender roles often place them on the front lines of scarcity. They're the first to notice when grain prices spike, when schoolyards fall silent from malnutrition, when the cracks in a system widen enough to swallow the vulnerable. The Aztecs encoded this insight into their mythology. Cihuacotl wasn't just a fortune teller, she held the title of Snake Woman, a nod to her dual nature. Like serpents that shed their skin, she symbolized both destruction and renewal. Modern parallels emerge in figures like Greta Thunberg, whose school strikes transformed climate statistics into moral outrage, or the indigenous water protectors at Standing Rock, who framed pipeline battles as battles for future generations. These voices don't just predict collapse, they redefine what survival looks like. The Aztecs feared Cihuacotl because she didn't prophesy in the abstract. She screamed of empty stomachs and broken promises, forcing society to confront what it tried to bury. But there's a crucial twist the myths emphasize. These warnings often go unheeded until it's too late. Cihuacotl's cries were literally institutionalized. The Aztecs appointed a real-life political advisor called the Cihuacotl to balance the emperor's power, yet her symbolic counterpart remained an outcast, howling at the edges of the empire. This tension between tokenism and real power reverberates today. Governments appoint sustainability councils while ignoring grassroots activists. Corporations celebrate women in leadership panels as income inequality skyrockets. The Aztecs might recognize this dance, giving prophetic voices titles without traction, platforms without power. Yet the most potent lesson lies in how these female figures reframe collapse itself. Male-dominated prophecies like the Fifth Sun's earthquakes focus on spectacular destruction events that leave ruins for archaeologists to study. Quetzalcoatl's visions, by contrast, centered on slow violence, generations lost to famine, the quiet erosion of trust, the way trauma lingers like smoke long after the fire. Modern movements led by women and marginalized groups follow this pattern. They don't just warn of climate tipping points, they document the incremental toll. Farmers' suicides in Punjab, the mental health crisis in hurricane-ravaged Puerto Rico. The Aztec priestesses who interpreted her omens didn't use celestial charts, they read the tremors in community networks, the way a mother detects illness in a child's breath before the fever spikes. Perhaps that's why these voices haunt us. They don't offer the false comfort of clean apocalypses. They insist collapse isn't an event. It's a process already unfolding in the places we've taught ourselves not to see. When the Aztecs described Quetzalcoatl weeping for children who would never be born, they could have been channeling today's birth strikers protesting climate inaction, or the Ugandan girls filing lawsuits against oil pipelines that jeopardize their fertility. The through line is stark. Patriarchy and empire share a fatal blind spot. They mistake the silencing of warnings for their resolution. But as the snake woman knew all too well, a prophecy ignored doesn't vanish. It coils quietly in the shadows, waiting to strike. For the Aztecs, the end of the world wasn't a finale, it was an intermission. Their vision of the afterlife, Mictlan, wasn't some heavenly reward but a 9-layered underworld where souls undertook a grueling 4-year journey through darkness, wind, and obsidian blades to reach oblivion. This wasn't punishment, it was purification, a reset button for the cosmos. Modern doomsday preppers stocking underground bunkers with decades of canned goods or tech elites plotting Martian colonies aren't so different. They're all playing variations on the same theme: how to navigate the unimaginable when the world as we know it ceases to exist. Mictlan's blueprint reveals chilling pragmatism. Souls had to traverse rivers of blood, deserts of crushing loneliness, and mountains that clashed together like living jaws, each trial stripping away another layer of their former selves. The Aztecs understood something we often forget. Survival isn't just about preserving the body, it's about shedding the psychological baggage of a vanished world. Compare that to today's billionaire bunkers in New Zealand, where Silicon Valley's elite install meditation pods alongside emergency rations, or the Mars Society's obsession with mental resilience training for off-world colonists. The hardware changes, but the software remains the same, the recognition that post-collapse existence demands radical adaptation, not just stockpiles. Yet the differences are equally revealing. Where Mictlan was democratic, all souls went there unless dying in childbirth or battle. Modern survival fantasies reek of hierarchy. Luxury apocalypse condos like Survival Condo Project offer tiered memberships. Gold level gets you a private theater and hydroponic garden, while basic tiers share bunk beds. The Aztecs saw the afterlife as a great equalizer. We've turned it into a subscription service. Even space colonization carries this divide. Elon Musk tweets about making humanity multiplanetary, while NASA-owned studies admit Martian settlers would likely develop a permanent underclass of maintenance workers. The most haunting parallel lies in what these visions ignore. Aztec priests warned that Mictlan's journey required guide small dog figurines placed in graves to help souls cross the underworld's rivers. Without them, even the strongest warrior would wander eternally. Today's prepper culture fixates on gear and calories but often overlooks the social architecture of survival. When Superstorm Sandy hit New York, the most resilient neighborhoods weren't those with the best generators. They were the ones with strong community networks who shared resources and information. The billionaires building isolated fortresses might as well be packing their tombs with gold instead of guide dogs. Space colonization fantasies repeat this oversight. Generation ship simulations repeatedly fail not because of technical glitches, but because test crews cut off from Earth's social rhythms descend into paranoia and infighting. The Aztecs ritualized this truth in their new fire ceremony, where every household had to relight their hearth from a communal flame. Survival, they understood, is collective. No amount of dehydrated food or oxygen tanks can replace that fundamental wiring, but perhaps the sharpest contrast is in timelines. Mictlan's 4-year journey had an in-point dissolution into nothingness, making way for the next cosmic cycle. Modern post-apocalyptic fantasies, by contrast, imagine perpetual stasis, endless years in a bunker waiting for, what? A return to normal. The Aztecs would have found this laughable. Their prophecies taught that afterworlds weren't escapes but chrysalises. The fifth sun's collapse wasn't the end, it was the necessary death before the sixth sun's birth. This reveals the fatal flaw in our survival blueprints. We're preparing to endure collapse, not transform through it. The Aztecs buried their dead with tools for the next world, not to rebuild the old one but to navigate the new. Their prophecies whisper a question we've yet to answer. When the dust settles, will we still be clutching the wreckage of a dead civilization, or will we finally learn to let go? Today's Mexico revival movements don't just study Aztec prophecies, they rewrite them in real time. In the alleyways of Mexico City and the courtyards of Los Angeles, descendants of the Nahuatl-speaking peoples gather not to mourn a lost civilization, but to resurrect its wisdom as a blueprint for survival. These aren't historical reenactors, they're modern-day Tlacuilos, the scribe priests who once painted codices, now decoding ancient omens through the lens of climate collapse, gentrification, and digital alienation. When they recite the legend of the fifth sun's end, they don't speak of earthquakes as abstract divine punishment. They point to the literal cracks in their neighborhoods, subsiding streets from overpumped aquifers, earthquake rubble from shoddy construction, as proof that the prophecy is unfolding not in mythic time but on their doorsteps. What makes this revival radical is its refusal to treat collapse as passive fate. Traditional Aztec cosmology saw the fifth sun's destruction as inevitable, something to delay through ritual. But today's Mexica intellectuals flip the script. At a recent ceremony in Tlatelolco, activists reinterpreted the new fire ceremony, traditionally about reigniting the sun, into a protest against fossil fuels, lighting torches from solar reflectors rather than sacred flames. Their argument, if the original prophecy warned of imbalance, then fighting carbon emissions isn't defiance, it's fulfilling ancient obligations. This isn't just symbolism, it's strategic reframing. By claiming prophecy as a call to action rather than resignation, they're doing what the Florentine Codex survivors couldn't, rewriting the narrative before the final act. The movement's most potent innovation lies in blending old and new warning systems. Ancient Tlacuilos tracked celestial events, modern Mexica scholars track satellite data. A collective in Ecatepec overlays colonial-era flood maps with climate models to predict which marginalized communities will drown first, framing it as the return of Chalchutlicue, the water goddess whose tears once drowned the fourth sun. Others draw direct lines between the Spanish plagues and today's cartel violence, both collapses enabled by fractured social immune systems. The brilliance of this approach is its duality. When authorities dismiss their concerns as superstition, they wield peer-reviewed studies. When academics call their data apocalyptic, they cite 600-year-old glyphs predicting the same patterns. Yet this revival isn't monolithic. Disputes erupt between purists who demand exact recreations of rituals and syncretists weaving in Catholic saints or anarchist theory. Some factions focus on land-back movements, arguing that reclaiming stolen territory fulfills prophecies about the earth swallowing oppressors. Others prioritize language revival, believing Nahuatl's complex verb tenses, which embed respect for ecological relationships, can reprogram modern minds against extractive thinking. The tension mirrors the Aztec Empire's own contradictions. Is tradition an anchor or a sail? Should prophecies be preserved like museum pieces or hacked like open-source code? The answer might lie in an unexpected place: video games. Mexico developers are creating interactive codices where players navigate collapse scenarios based on real climate data and ancient warnings. One game casts you as a neighborhood organizer, balancing ritual obligations with practical survival. Distribute maize from reclaimed chinampas or let it rot to appease Tlaloc. These digital Tlacuilos aren't just teaching history, they're stress-testing strategies for the unraveling their ancestors predicted. It's prophecy as simulation practice for the real thing. What emerges from this movement isn't nostalgia, but something far more potent, a lived experiment in time-bending resilience. When dancers at Zocalo Square perform the Danza de los Voladores with solar panels strapped to their backs, they're not just honoring the past. They're proving that the best way to prepare for the next world might be to finally listen to those who saw this one ending centuries ago. The Aztec priests who sliced open quail to read their entrails would have understood our obsession with algorithms instantly. Both are methods of extracting hidden patterns from chaos. While they studied the way blood pooled around a sacrificed bird's liver, we train neural networks on terabytes of data, seeking the same thing: glimpses of what's coming. The tools have changed, but the desperation remains identical. Just as the Aztecs believed animal organs reflected cosmic imbalances, today's predictive AIs treat social media trends and market fluctuations as digital entrails, scanning for fractures in the system. Consider how modern collapse forecasting models operate. Programs like the Sentinel system or the Global Crisis Severity Index ingest everything from grocery prices to satellite images of nighttime lighting, flagging anomalies the way Aztec seers interpreted comets or two-headed calves. When an AI detects a sudden spike in black market currency trades in Venezuela, it's echoing priests who warned of economic doom when cacao beans started circulating outside royal markets. Both systems share a core assumption: collapse leaves traces long before it arrives, not in the grand gestures of history books, but in the mundane. The Aztecs tracked ant colonies abandoning their mounds. We monitor supply chain delays for baby formula or lithium. Yet the parallels grow darker. Aztec divination wasn't just about prediction, it was about control. By interpreting omens, priests claimed the power to influence outcomes through rituals. Our algorithmic models do the same, though we call it preemptive policy intervention or market correction. When the Federal Reserve tweaks interest rates based on unemployment forecasts, or when China's social credit system restricts travel for citizens flagged as high risk, they're performing a modern version of the new fire ceremony, using data-driven rituals to stave off disorder. The critical difference: where the Aztecs confessed their model's fallibility, the gods are fickle. We cloak ours in the illusion of mathematical infallibility. The most unsettling similarity lies in how both systems fail. Aztec codices recount instances where prophecies became self-fulfilling, nobles hoarding grain because priests predicted famine, thereby causing shortages. Today's predictive AIs create similar feedback loops. Algorithmic policing tools like PredPol, which forecast crime hotspots, disproportionately target marginalized neighborhoods, ensuring more arrests there and reinforcing the bias. Stock market flash crashes triggered by automated trading algorithms mirror the Aztec elite's panic when eclipse predictions spark destructive rituals. Both reveal a tragic truth: the tools we design to foresee collapse often accelerate it, but there's a crucial divergence the Aztecs might find naive. Their diviners accepted that some omens were fundamentally incomprehensible, what they called the whispers of Tezcatlipoca, the god of chaos. Modern data science, by contrast, insists every variable can be quantified. When climate models fail to predict record-shattering heat waves or AI-powered pandemic forecasts miss mutation jumps, We blame incomplete data rather than acknowledging, as the Aztecs did, that some forces resist modeling. Their humility in the face of uncertainty might be the prophecy we most need to recover. Perhaps the ultimate lesson lies in what gets overlooked. The Aztecs missed Cortés not because their diviners failed, but because they filtered observations through ancient frameworks, assuming the floating mountains were mythological rather than technological. Today's AI risks the same blind spot, training on historical data while novel threats emerge. An algorithm scanning for financial collapse indicators might flag bank runs but miss a cryptocurrency implosion, just as priests tracking traditional omens overlooked smallpox. Both systems, in their brilliance, become prisoners of their own patterns. The feathered serpent slithers past unnoticed while we stare at the entrails in our hands. When Spanish ships first breached Aztec shores, they brought more than cannons and steel. They carried invisible passengers deadlier than any army. Smallpox raced through Tenochtitlan's canals and marketplaces like a vengeful spirit, leaving bodies so fast survivors couldn't bury them. Aztec scribes described pustules erupting like cursed flowers, victims dying mid-sentence, their faces still twisted in confusion. But what's chilling isn't just the horror, it's how seamlessly they wove the plague into their prophecies. The goddess Tezitzimitl, they believed, had sent the sickness as punishment for imperial excess, her star demons descending to cleanse the world with purging fire. Sound familiar? Scroll through COVID-era Twitter, and you'll find the same narrative arcs: vaccines framed as mark of the beast by some, divine retribution for capitalism, or climate crimes by others. The Aztecs weren't wrong about pandemics heralding collapse, just mistaken about their origin. Modern epidemiologists recognize disease surges as reliable collapse indicators, often appearing when empires strain their ecological and social immune systems. Rome's Antonine Plague followed unsustainable expansion into germ-rich lowlands. The Black Death exploded along medieval trade routes stretched too thin. COVID ripped through nations already fractured by inequality and distrust. The Aztecs saw smallpox as supernatural wrath, but their intuition about its timing was eerily accurate. Plagues thrive on the fissures that foretell systemic failure. What makes their response so revealing is the duality of their reaction. While priests performed frantic sacrifices to appease the gods, ordinary citizens developed pragmatic quarantines, isolating the sick in reed huts downwind from villages. This tension between mysticism and practical adaptation mirrors our own pandemic whiplash: governments oscillating between trust the science rhetoric and magical thinking about herd immunity thresholds. The Aztec elite's fatal error was clinging to ritual solutions while the virus exploited their interconnected empire. When neighboring city-states saw Tenochtitlan falter, they didn't send healers. They seized the moment to revolt, just as modern populist movements used COVID disruptions to undermine global institutions. Yet the most haunting parallel lies in the blame game. Aztec nobles accused marginalized groups of poisoning the air, triggering pogroms against outlying tribes. Spanish friars later documented survivors whispering that the plague proved their rulers had lost the gods' favor, a narrative Cortés eagerly weaponized. Fast forward to 2020, and the scapegoating playbook remains unchanged. Asian elders beaten in New York subways, anti-maskers vilified as plague rats, politicians branding variants with xenophobic labels. Pandemics don't just kill bodies, they dissolve social contracts, revealing which bonds are strong enough to endure shared suffering and which were illusions all along. The ultimate tragedy of the Aztec pandemic narrative isn't that they misinterpreted smallpox as prophecy, it's that they weren't entirely wrong. Their civilization did require purification. Not by deities, but by the inevitable consequences of an overextended empire built on resource exploitation and fragile alliances. When we dismiss COVID conspiracies as mere ignorance, we risk missing their uncomfortable kernel of truth. Societies often get the plagues their systems have silently incubated. The mosquitoes breeding in Tenochtitlan's over-engineered canals weren't so different from the wet markets and hyper-connected travel networks of our era, both unintended invitations for pathogens to rewrite history. Perhaps that's why these stories resonate across centuries. They force us to confront an unsettling equation. Pandemics aren't random disasters, but stress tests for civilizations. The Aztecs could rebuild their temples after earthquakes, but smallpox exposed vulnerabilities no amount of sacred architecture could fix. Our own scramble for vaccines and ventilators laid bare similar fault lines: hoarded patents, crumbling hospitals, the brutal calculus of who got oxygen and who was left to gasp. The prophecies were right all along, just not in the way we expected. Collapse rarely comes from a single blow. It arrives on the breath of the infected, in the space between what we claimed to value and what we actually protected. The Aztec Empire didn't just crumble under Spanish swords, it collapsed under the weight of its own currency. At the height of their power, the Aztecs used cocoa beans as money, with strict laws enforcing their value. A single bean could buy a tamale, 100 might purchase a slave, and counterfeiters faced execution for filling empty bean shells with mud. But when Cortés arrived, this delicate economic ecosystem shattered almost overnight. Spanish conquistadors, obsessed with gold, dismissed cocoa as trivial, flooding markets with stolen beans while simultaneously disrupting the trade routes that gave them value. The result, hyperinflation so severe that by 1521, a basket of beans couldn't buy what a handful once could. The Aztecs didn't just lose a war, they watched their entire concept of worth evaporate like morning dew on a marketplace table. Fast forward to today's cryptocurrency crashes, and the patterns feel unnervingly familiar. Bitcoin's wild swings, soaring to $69,000 before plunging over 70%, mirror the cocoa beans' trajectory. Both systems shared a fatal vulnerability. Their value relied entirely on collective belief rather than intrinsic worth. The Aztecs trusted cocoa because their government enforced its scarcity. Crypto traders trust blockchain because algorithms enforce its limits. But when that faith wavers, the fall is catastrophic. In 1520, it was Spanish looters dumping beans onto the market. In 2022, it was Elon Musk tweeting that Tesla wouldn't accept Bitcoin, triggering a $2 trillion meltdown. The technology changes, but the psychology of speculative bubbles remains hauntingly consistent. Yet the parallels run deeper than volatility. Both the Aztec and modern financial systems reveal how currencies act as canaries in empire collapse. The Aztec cocoa economy depended on tribute from conquered cities. When those supply lines frayed, the monetary system imploded. Today's fiat currencies, from the US dollar to the Venezuelan bolivar, are equally tied to political stability. When Rome's emperors debased silver coins with lead, their economy crumbled alongside their borders. When modern governments print money to mask deficits, they're repeating the same gamble. The Aztecs would recognize our current predicament instantly. Currencies aren't just tools of trade, they're mirrors reflecting an empire's health. The most chilling similarity lies in how both systems bred inequality. Aztec elites hoarded cocoa beans in ornate chests, while farmers bartered crops as inflation rendered their savings worthless. Sound familiar? Today's billionaires park wealth in Bitcoin cold wallets, while wage earners watch inflation erode paychecks. The Aztecs even had their version of bank runs, panicked nobles demanding beans from state warehouses when rumors spread of Spanish plunder. Modern crypto exchanges like FTX replay this script verbatim, with users frantically withdrawing digital assets as trust evaporates. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes sometimes in hexadecimal code. But here's where the comparison twists unexpectedly. The Aztec collapse gave rise to a hybrid economy. Spanish coins circulated alongside lingering cocoa beans for generations. Similarly, crypto's crashes haven't erased digital currency, they've forced adaptation. Stablecoins pegged to real-world assets now mimic the Aztec shift toward more tangible backing. Meanwhile, central bank digital currencies loom, threatening to repeat Spain's imperial playbook by absorbing decentralized systems into state control. The lesson isn't that currencies die, it's that they evolve under pressure, often in ways their creators never intended. What the Aztecs couldn't foresee, but their cocoa crisis foreshadowed, was how monetary collapse accelerates political unraveling. When beans lost value, Aztec merchants abandoned markets, soldiers refused tribute missions, and allied cities stopped sending goods. A similar disintegration plays out today when inflation spikes, supply chains seize, protests erupt, and faith in institutions crumbles. The Maya civilization, neighbors to the Aztecs, left glyphs warning that money is the blood of the kingdom, or once it sickens, the body politic follows. Modern economists dress this insight in clinical terms like velocity of money or liquidity traps, but the Aztecs understood the visceral truth. When people stop believing in what backs their wealth, societies don't just stumble, they fracture. Yet within this grim history glimmers an unexpected insight. The Aztec cocoa system's fragility was also its resilience. Unlike gold, which the Spanish stole, and melted beans had to be continually grown, traded, and consumed. Their value was rooted in living networks of trust and labor, not inert metal. Modern cryptocurrencies, for all their volatility, share this potential. Blockchain's transparency could prevent the hidden inflation that doomed fiat currencies from Rome to Weimar. The Aztecs might smile at decentralized finance's promise, a system where money can't be corrupted by kings or conquistadors. But their story whispers a warning: no currency, no matter how ingeniously designed, survives the collapse of the world that gave it meaning. The myth of Aztlan begins with a journey not of conquest but of survival. According to Nahua legends, the Aztec ancestors emerged from a mist-shrouded homeland called Aztlan, a place of white herons and twisted reeds, before wandering for generations in search of their destined city. The prophets among them carried an ominous warning: each time their people settled too comfortably, disaster would force them to move again. Droughts scorched their crops, floods swallowed their temples, and rival tribes burned their villages until they learned the hardest lesson of all: that permanence itself was an illusion. Today, as climate disasters displace millions and border walls rise across continents, this ancient migration story feels less like myth and more like a blueprint for our unraveling world. The parallels between Aztlan's legends and modern displacement crises are too stark to ignore. Aztec codices depict families carrying children and seed bundles through deserts, their sandaled feet cracking under the sun, images that could be ripped from today's headlines about Syrian refugees trekking through Balkan snowstorms or Central American caravans fleeing crop failures. The Mexica people's centuries-long migration from Aztlan to Tenochtitlan wasn't just a historical event. It was a recurring pattern they ritualized in ceremonies like the burning of the banners, where they symbolically reenacted their nomadic roots to remember their fragility. Contemporary border policies might seem like modern innovations, but the Aztecs had their own version: tribal leaders negotiating safe passage with city-states, paying tolls in jade or Quetzal feathers, or being turned away when resources were scarce. The difference: where modern nations frame migration as a crisis, the Aztecs understood it as an inevitable response to environmental and political pressures. Climate scientists now recognize what these ancient prophecies implied. Mass migration isn't an anomaly, it's one of Earth's oldest coping mechanisms for systemic collapse. When the Aztecs described Aztlan as a wetland that slowly turned to salt flats, they were documenting what researchers today call ecological succession, the process where rising salinity from irrigation or sinking water tables transforms fertile regions into wastelands. The Aral Sea's evaporation in the 20th century and the creeping desertification of Africa's Sahel zone follow this same script. What the Aztecs framed as divine punishment, the gods withholding rain until we prove our worth, modern climatologists attribute to deforestation and aquifer depletion. Yet both perspectives converge on the same outcome. When the land can no longer sustain life, people have no choice but to become the wandering ones their ancestors warned about. The most chilling aspect of the Aztlan prophecy isn't its accuracy, but its cyclical nature. Aztec elders taught that their migration wasn't unique. Every civilization before them had been forced to abandon homelands, from the ruined cities of the Toltecs to the ghostly pyramids of Teotihuacan. Their codices depict these abandoned sites not with horror but with solemn resignation, as if collapse and renewal were seasons in some great agricultural calendar. Today's archaeologists confirm this pattern. The Bronze Age collapse, the Mayan diaspora, the Dust Bowl exodus, all followed similar arcs of environmental stress triggering mass movement. The Aztecs would nod knowingly at Australia's climate refugee visa debates or the disappearance of Arctic villages into thawing permafrost. To them, these wouldn't be unprecedented crises, but the latest turn of a wheel they'd seen crush empires before. Yet there's a crucial difference between ancient migrations and modern ones that the Aztlan myth exposes. When the Mexica people wandered, they carried their entire cosmological worldview with them, their gods, their agricultural knowledge, their social contracts. Today's displaced populations often arrive in societies that treat them as disruptions rather than contributors. The Aztecs transformed swamps into chinampas and volcanic islands into metropolis. Modern refugee camps become permanent limbo spaces. This disconnect hints at a deeper collapse indicator, not just the movement of people, but the failure of systems to adapt to that movement. The prophets of Aztlan warned that those who refused to make room for wanderers would eventually become wanderers themselves, a lesson written in the ruins of every fortress civilization from the Great Wall to the Berlin Wall. Hidden within these migration stories is an uncomfortable truth about collapse narratives themselves. The Aztecs didn't frame their journey from Aztlan as tragedy. It was the crucible that forged their identity. Their greatest rulers boasted of their humble nomadic origins, much like American pioneers mythologized covered wagons. This reframing challenges modern anxieties about border crises. Perhaps the real threat isn't the movement of people, but our inability to see it as anything other than catastrophe. When climate models predict entire Pacific islands will need relocation this century, the question isn't whether migration will happen, it's whether we'll repeat the Aztecs' adaptive wisdom or the inflexibility of the empires they outlasted. The final lesson of Aztlan isn't in the wandering, but in what was carried forward. Aztec migrants didn't just bring physical seeds, they preserved stories about the ecological mistakes that doomed their homeland. Today's diaspora communities do the same. Somali refugees in Minnesota document desertification oral histories. Bangladeshi climate migrants in Delhi teach flood-resistant farming techniques. These aren't just survival strategies, they're the modern equivalents of the Aztecs' sacred bundles, containers of knowledge for rebuilding after collapse. The prophecy was never really about predicting the end. It was about ensuring something survived it. Malinche wasn't just a translator, she was a living omen, a woman who stood at the collision point of two collapsing worlds. To the Aztecs, her ability to speak Nahuatl and Mayan, then rapidly learn Spanish, made her seem like a conduit for divine messages. When she warned Cortés about ambushes or decoded Moctezuma's diplomatic traps, she wasn't merely aiding conquest. She was fulfilling an ancient prophecy about the tongue that would unravel kingdoms. Yet here's what most histories miss. Malinche's real power wasn't in betraying her people, but in controlling the flow of information during civilization's unspooling. In the chaos of collapse, whoever shapes the narrative doesn't just survive, they rewrite reality itself. Consider how prophecy framed her role. Aztec seers had long warned about women who walk between worlds, figures destined to guide invaders during times of upheaval. These weren't arbitrary predictions, they reflected a brutal truth about how empires fracture. When systems fail, the marginalized often gain sudden leverage. Slaves become interpreters, outcasts turn into guides, Malinche, sold into slavery as a child by her own family, embodied this inversion. Her intimate knowledge of Aztec political intricacies, gained from the bottom rungs of society, made her more dangerous to Tenochtitlan than any cannon. Modern parallels lurk everywhere: whistleblowers toppling corrupt regimes, hacker collectives exposing state secrets, even AI models trained on marginalized voices suddenly appending centuries of cultural narratives. Collapse doesn't just level hierarchies, it weaponizes the overlooked. The Spanish conquest playbook reveals the mechanics of this transformation. Cortés didn't win through superior arms alone. He won by weaponizing Malinche's ability to intercept, distort, and selectively transmit information. When Moctezuma sent envoys bearing gold to appease the strangers, Malinche reframed the gifts as tribute from a fearful ruler. When Aztec generals planned nighttime attacks, she delivered their strategies to Cortés hours in advance. This wasn't mere translation, it was narrative warfare, turning every exchanged word into a brick torn from the empire's walls. Today's misinformation campaigns, from deepfake propaganda to algorithmic radicalization, follow the same blueprint. Control the flow of meaning during crisis, and you control the aftermath. Yet the most devastating lesson lies in how Malinche's legacy got rewritten. Spanish chroniclers painted her as a willing collaborator, while post-colonial Mexico branded her La Chingada, the violated betrayer. Both narratives erased her impossible choices: a teenage girl navigating annihilation, bargaining survival for entire communities in real time. This erasure mirrors how modern collapse narratives get shaped by victors. Financial crisis architects rebrand as rescuers, climate polluters spin themselves as innovation leaders. The Aztecs understood this phenomenon well. Their own histories were systematically burned by friars who called it erasing idolatry, just as TikTok archives of protest movements vanish under content moderation. Buried in this manipulation is a prophetic insight the Aztecs themselves anticipated. Their codices warned that during the Fifth Sun's collapse, truth would shatter like obsidian, with each fragment reflecting a different version of reality. Malinche's story epitomizes this fracturing. To some, she was a pragmatic survivor, to others, a cultural Judas, but her deepest legacy might be exposing how collapse amplifies all interpretations until they drown out facts. In an age where AI chatbots hallucinate histories and deepfake videos rewrite wars in real time, her predicament feels eerily familiar. When the foundations crumble, the real battle isn't over territory, it's over whose story gets etched into the new world's bones. Perhaps that's why Malinche still haunts Mexico's collective memory, not as a villain or victim, but as a mirror. She forces us to confront the uncomfortable fluidity of loyalty when systems fail, the way crisis twists even survival into betrayal. The Aztec prophecy about the unraveling tongue was never really about her, it was about us. Every time we watch a revolution get co-opted online, or a disaster narrative gets spun by those in power, we're reliving her dilemma. In the end, Malinche's greatest warning isn't from the past. It's a whisper from the future, telling us that when the next collapse comes, the translators won't just record history, they'll decide who gets to have one. Mel Gibson's Apocalypto opens with a quote straight from Aztec prophecy. "A great civilization is not conquered from without until it has destroyed itself from within." The film's portrayal of a Maya society tearing itself apart before Spanish ships appear might as well be a modern parable. Substitute the jungle for social media outrage, the sacrificial altars for late-stage capitalism's relentless grind, and the arrival of distant sails for climate disaster looming on the horizon. Hollywood didn't just borrow Aztec imagery, it tapped into their deepest existential fear that empires don't fall to external forces alone. They crumble when their own people stop believing in the stories holding them together. Video games take this theme even further. In Sid Meier's Civilization VI, playing as the Aztecs unlocks a unique ability called Gifts for the Tlatoni. where conquered cities provide bonus resources, a mechanic that perfectly mirrors their historical reliance on tribute systems. But here's where the prophecy twist kicks in. If you neglect cultural cohesion while expanding too fast, your city's rebel. The game turns Aztec collapse anxiety into a playable algorithm, proving their warnings about overextension weren't mystical mumbo-jumbo, they were game theory avant la lettre. Even the graphics echo this. When your civilization falters, the screen darkens as if the fifth sun itself is flickering out. Music wraps these ancient fears in modern soundscapes. Mexican metal band Brujeria's Rosa Odiada samples Aztec war chants over grinding guitars, framing immigration battles as a new kind of conquest. Meanwhile, Billie Eilish's All Good Girls Go to Hell music video features her sinking into black tar, surrounded by iconography ripped straight from Aztec underworld myths. These artists aren't just referencing the past, they're using its symbols to process present-day collapse vibes. When rappers like Kendrick Lamar declare, "The whole world going mad," they're channeling the same urgency Aztec priests felt scanning the stars for signs of chaos. The real revelation isn't that pop culture references Aztec prophecies, it's that we've subconsciously adopted their framework for understanding crisis. Post-apocalyptic movies like Mad Max show societies reduced to resource wars, echoing Aztec legends about the fourth sun's drought-driven cannibalism. Survival games like Horizon Zero Dawn depict nature reclaiming skyscrapers, mirroring their belief that civilizations are mere intervals between jungle and jungle. Even children's media gets in on it. The Road to El Dorado's lighthearted adventure hides a dark joke about how gold-obsessed empires blind themselves to reality. What makes these modern retellings so potent is their ambiguity. Unlike simplistic doomsday tales, they capture the Aztec view of collapse as both tragedy and transformation. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Lara Croft triggers an apocalyptic flood while trying to prevent one, a twist straight out of Aztec moral philosophy, where averting fate often accelerates it. Netflix's Maya and the Three reimagines the fifth sun's end as a teenage girl's coming-of-age story, suggesting rebirth requires swallowing hard truths. These narratives reject the idea of pure heroes or villains, instead sitting with the uncomfortable truth the Aztecs knew too well. Sometimes survival means letting old worlds burn so new ones can rise from the ashes. Perhaps the most intriguing evolution is in interactive storytelling. Games like El Paso elsewhere cast players as an Aztec vampire hunter battling monsters in a time-looping motel, literally reliving cycles of destruction. Virtual reality experiences now let users witness the fall of Tenochtitlan firsthand, complete with olfactory simulations of burning copal incense. This isn't just entertainment, it's ritual for the digital age, allowing modern audiences to confront collapse in a controlled environment, the way Aztec ceremonies let participants rehearse the end of the world safely. The medium changes, but the compulsion remains, to stare into the abyss and whisper, "What if we're next?" Beneath the spectacle lies a quiet revolution in how we process collective dread. The Aztecs painted their prophecies on bark paper. We render ours in pixels and surround sound. Their seers passed animal entrails. We binge-watch dystopian series for clues. When a TikTok trend aesthetizes Aztecor, mixing streetwear with Nahuatl glyphs, it's not cultural appropriation. It's the latest incarnation of an ancient impulse to dress the wound of uncertainty with symbols that say, "This has happened before." We remember, the prophecies endure not because they predict specifics, but because they name the unshakable truth every generation must rediscover, that civilizations, like people, live most fully when they acknowledge their mortality. The Aztecs didn't just predict collapse, they mapped its anatomy with terrifying precision, tracing the cracks that form long before empires crumble. Their prophecies weren't crystal ball fantasies, They were diagnostics born from centuries observing how power corrodes, how elites grow deaf to dissent, how ecosystems buckle under greed. And as we stand amid our own unraveling climate accelerations, brittle supply chains, institutions straining under polarization, their warnings echo with unnerving clarity. The question isn't whether they saw our future, but why we're repeating their past. Take their obsession with imbalance. The Fifth Sun's doom wasn't random. It was the inevitable result of societies taking more than they returned, of leaders hoarding while the land withered. Today, we've quantified this intuition with terms like planetary boundaries and wealth inequality metrics, but the diagnosis remains identical. When Aztec scribes described nobles feasting atop pyramids as farmers starved, they might as well have been sketching modern boardrooms where CEOs pay balloons alongside food insecurity. Their prophecies didn't just warn of disaster, they exposed the math of collapse, the way exploitation compounds until systems snap. We've swapped cocoa beans for cryptocurrencies, but the pattern holds. Civilizations don't fall when resources vanish. They fall when the scales tip too far. Yet the Aztecs' true genius lay in recognizing collapse as a spectrum, not an event. Their codices detail phases we now codify in academic papers: the complacency of early decay, the frantic ritualizing of late-stage denial, the moment when elites mistake performative urgency for action. When Moctezuma hesitated, doubting Cortez's threat until Spanish boots marched into Tenochtitlan, he wasn't just cowardly. He was trapped in what sociologists today call normalcy bias, the refusal to accept disruptive change until it's irreversible. Sound familiar? Climate accords signed with loopholes, AI ethics panels stacked with lobbyists, banks gambling on infinite growth on a finite planet. We're all Moctezuma now, clinging to playbooks while the world burns. What makes their model uniquely relevant isn't its pessimism, but its brutal pragmatism. They didn't waste prophecies on vague doom. They specified triggers: leaders isolating in palaces, markets rigged against the many, the moment when sacred fires guttered from neglect. These weren't metaphors, they were checklists, and here's the uncomfortable truth: our systems are scoring worse than theirs. At least the Aztecs had new fire ceremonies to reset excess. Our rituals, quarterly earnings calls, election cycles, carbon offset purchases, are designed to sustain dysfunction, not disrupt it. They prepared for collapse as inevitable but delayable. We pretend ours is impossible until it's undeniable. But buried in their direst visions was a radical hope. The Fifth Sun's end wasn't final, it was meant to clear space for the Sixth. This wasn't passive fatalism, it was a call to align with cyclical renewal, to build systems that could dissolve and regrow like forests after fire. Modern movements channel this wisdom, from circular economies that mimic nature's zero-waste cycles to indigenous water protectors reviving ancient land stewardship models. The Aztecs' real legacy isn't a warning about how civilizations die. It's a challenge to redefine what survival means. So ask yourself, when future historians dissect our age, will they find us wiser than Moctezuma? Will they note how we heeded the prophets, not just those in temples, but in climate labs and algorithm audits, or how we silenced them to protect brittle hierarchies? The Aztecs left us more than prophecies, they left a mirror, and in its reflection we don't see the end of the world, just the end of one way of living in it. The next chapter isn't written yet.